This is the first of two videos on painting icebergs, and this one is from a photograph that Wendy sent me. And I am wetting the entire sky area because I want to do a soft blue cloudy sky behind the iceberg, sort of like the photograph, which I later changed, and that's why I did a second video, because I found the sky was not dark enough. The bright white iceberg needed a much darker sky to set it off and make it look bright and white. So when you see me doing this first step, think about maybe darkening it or not doing as many white clouds if you do this exercise. I'm using here Cerulean blue and Cobalt blue for my blue sky. They are lovely colors for doing a summery blue sky with lovely soft clouds, but for this it just wasn't dramatic enough, and I left far too many white clouds. So after I'd finished painting the iceberg, it just kind of disappeared into the background and didn't stand out how I wanted it to. And later you'll see that I fixed that by putting a much darker sky behind. I mixed up some burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and I darkened the clouds, made them more moody and stormy, which set the iceberg off much better. So as you're watching this, just think about the fact that this was not the best beginning for me for this painting. But I left it in anyway because I want to show why I fixed it and how I fixed it, and why I did a second one, because I wanted to try it with a much stronger, flatter sky the second time around. I'm using my Kleenex to just pull out a little of the moisture in the clouds. If you make the paper quite wet, you'll get lovely soft clouds, but sometimes they don't dry quick enough and you don't get that lovely softness. So always good to have a Kleenex to hand. And now I'm going to mix up a little bit of a sort of a purpley grey. I'm mixing permanent rose, cobalt blue, and raw sienna. Those are my favorite three for soft greys, especially greys in clouds. And I'm going to add some grey to the clouds. I'm testing that. Always test your mix on a little piece of paper before you put it on your actual painting. It saves a lot of grief. I'm adding a little bit more raw sienna. I want to warm that up a little bit. And when I say warm it up, it's a cool grey, but I want to add a warm tone to it. So I will add one of my warm colours, like the raw sienna, burnt sienna, the permanent rose. They're all warm colours, and they will warm it up. And part of the reason for that is for the iceberg and the ocean, I'm going to use a lot of cool colours. That's colours in the green family and the cool blue. So I've mixed up Viridian with a little bit of azo yellow, and I'm going to use that for the very lightest parts of the ocean. They will look much, much lighter when they dry, and when I get the darks in, that will make them look lighter. And I'm using the mix fairly diluted. Viridian green is a lovely cool green, quite soft. I could have used phthalo green, and in the next little mix you see beside it there's some phthalo green, but phthalo green is a strong pigment. I'm using that where I want a stronger color in the background. And you have to be very careful when you use a strong pigment like phthalo green, otherwise it's going to take over your whole picture and be far too dominant. So you need to be aware of that when you mix it. I've mixed it with some cobalt blue to soften it and take away some of the acidity. Acidity is when you have the very strong yellows and greens. Sort of like, think about limes as being acidic, and if you have greens that are limey, they're very acidic greens. So I wanted a little bit more gentle, a little bit more soft blue in, and cobalt is a really soft blue. And I'm also using a little bit of cerulean blue in there. Again, cerulean blue is a cool blue, but it will soften the greens and add a little bit of cool blue to my ocean. Because of the ice and the iceberg, I want it to all look very cool. And that is why I want the sky to be a contrast, a complement to the very cool colours. Now I'm using my number 8 Silver Black Velvet round brush, which is one of my favorites. It seems to be good for Everything has a lovely point on it, nice fat belly to hold lots of wash, and I just get used to using it. Now I'm using Prussian Blue and Indigo and a little bit of the green that I've been using, that's the Viridian mix, and I've made a very, very dark mix for the foreground, again, but very cool. Prussian Blue, Indigo Blue, both very cool dark blues, and I'm putting those in around the ice that is floating on the ocean to really make it stand out as very white. Also on Wendy's photograph that she sent me, which she took on the East Coast when she went to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And I have to ask her where this one was taken, I've forgotten. But the photograph showed that as a very, very dark area on the ocean. And I like the contrast with the very light green. It got lighter over to the right, so I added more water to my mix. I want it nice and dark near the ice so it stands out. And if you watch there, I used a thirsty brush just to pull back a little bit of sort of a wave pattern. And behind the iceberg in the distance, the sea again was very, very dark. So I'm using that dark mix that I've just mixed up. And I actually placed the iceberg a little differently so that I could get part of it standing out against a very dark background. That's why I put it in a different spot, a little further down from the horizon, so that I had that contrast of light against dark. When you make a composition, you can do that. If things are not in exactly the right place for the best dramatic effect, you just move them. I dried that completely, made sure that was thoroughly dry, and I'm adding some Cobalt and Ultramarine Blue to that to make a shadow under the iceberg. Shadows are really important to make things look heavy, three-dimensional, real. And I was studying this photograph fairly carefully to make sure I got the lights and darks in the right place for the best contrast. And I'm really, for the iceberg, I'm working with all of my cool greens and blues. That would be Phthalo blue and Viridian green, maybe sometimes a little bit of Phthalo green with Cerulean blue as a cool blue. And I have Cobalt Teal next to the Cerulean Cobalt Teal, which is a core color I recently got. Very, very pretty, cool blue. And I'm using that very diluted to put shadows on the ice where it meets the ocean. You have to be very, very subtle when you're putting shadows, which means you need to mix your paint with a lot of water. I'm using my smaller brush. This is my number 4 brush. And being very gentle. I can always come back with a little bit of darker paint later on if I feel it's dried too light. But if I put it on too dark to start with, it's sometimes hard to wash it back, especially if you're using some of those strong colors that don't like to be washed back. And I'm working on this area because I want the other area to dry naturally. It's nice to use a hairdryer, but sometimes that will warp your paper. I've added a little bit of burnt sienna to that dark blue mix to put the land in the background. I don't want the land to be anything other than a sort of a dark shape in the background. And again, dark against the very light iceberg. I warmed it up, and again, when I say warm it up, I mean I put a warm color with my mix, which is the burnt sienna. That's a very warm orangey brown, and it will warm up any black or gray just for the contrast and the complement. Now here's how I'm fixing my sky. Everything is dry, and I'm re-wetting the sky because I want to darken it up and warm it up. The iceberg is all my cool colors, so I've mixed ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, and burnt sienna to make some dark, warmish gray clouds. And I had to wet the background so that I can get those clouds to be nice and soft and sort of meld them into my background, especially as I should have done this right at the beginning. And it's very difficult to do something like this halfway through, because you're disturbing other paint and you have already sort of worked on your iceberg. This is pure ultramarine I'm putting in here, a little bit dark maybe, but I want some strength, I want some strong color, and I don't want it to be all grey sky. And I judging that I've gone a little bit overboard with the strength of it using my Kleenex. And of course all these colors dry much lighter. Again, I'm going into the ultramarine blue to add blue sky that is darker than the one that I started with. I think I should have started with an ultramarine blue for the sky and put in these warm grey clouds right at the very beginning. And that's why you do lots of painting. That's why you do a lot of studies. You do one and you say, that was not right, I'm going to do another one and fix that. You do the second one. Sometimes it's something else on the second one doesn't go right. You do a third one. You just keep on trying, painting until you get it right, until you look at it and think, yeah, that one works. And it doesn't always work. So I had to edit the video a little bit so that it wasn't too long to upload, but you see the sky in the background now is much, much darker. And I'm using an extremely light mix for the shadow on the iceberg. It's the Cobalt Teal, a little bit of Viridian, a little bit of Cobalt Blue, watered right down. And I've put the shadow under the iceberg using various mixtures of those colors. They're all over my palette. I just dip into them when I need them. When I'm making the shadows, they have a lot of Viridian in them, and sometimes the tiniest bit of Phthalo blue or Phthalo green. But like I say, Phthalo green is a strong pigment. You need to be very careful because you're painting something that is white with shadows on, so you don't want anything overtaking that white color. You want it to sort of just glow through your little bit of shading and wash. And put them on in layers. I go in many layers, drying in between and washing them in with a wet brush. And I'm painting wet in wet here, a little bit of Cobalt Blue into the wet Teal and Viridian, and then it just blends right in. And blending it in myself with a wet brush, being careful not to go too dark and not to go too wet. I don't want blooms and blossoms everywhere. Controlling the water on my brush. And on the right hand side, I don't want to have too much shading at all. I want that to really stand out as very bright white against the dark sky. And I have to say, I was not happy with the sky. And that is why I did a second one, which I will upload, with a very different sky and a different iceberg. Just because I can get bored painting the same iceberg. Thank you for watching.